Len Oliver in 1986 wrote an article kind of bemoaning the lack of history that had been written about the game. And things have changed since 1986, in a large part thanks to a lot of the people here in this room. And so it is a fantastic privilege to be here with you and add my small piece to that puzzle. So, Dr. Manning, Gus Randolph Manning. He's a fascinatingly complex character in the American soccer narrative, and he embodies so much of what the sport in America was about, from its initial history going all the way back to the founding fathers of the Oneidas. We can have a fun discussion about them at some point, through to the immediate post-World War II era. He never lived to see the youth soccer revolution of the 1970s, the NASL, MLS, World Cup 94 and 99, and soon 2026, but 4 generations on, his great-great-great-great-nephew plays youth soccer down the I-34 in Austin, Texas. So some of his connections are still here to this day. He has a brief bio on the Hall of Fame page, but which barely scrapes the surface. So my objective today is to go a little further with that. Who was this mysterious man? He was one of the world's first football pioneers. He was a medical doctor by profession for much of his adult life, and he was one of the early games leaders in America, but in Germany, and in England and elsewhere. The biographical sketch here seeks to shed a little more light on this key individual. He bridged the early history of modern football, where he learned the game in 19th century Britain, with the 20th century's global expansion of the sport into an era of professionalization. He embodies that transition from the amateur game of Victorian England to the modern professional sport played all around the world. And his transnational life is a witness to the diffusion of sport. So this paper covers 3 parts: his English life, his German life, his American life, and I leave with a couple open questions that I hope will stimulate some discussion. So G.R. Manning, as he regularly signed his football-related correspondence for many years, was born Gustav Rudolf Leo Mannheimer on December 3 in Lewisham, South London. He came from a Hessian-Prussian family. His mother was born near Frankfurt, and then moved shortly thereafter to Paris and had as you can see in the Manning family memoirs written by Philip Manning, one of Gus Manning's brothers, a careful Parisian upbringing. His father was born in 1843 in East Prussia in Königsberg, and according to family memoirs, he was said to have been a trained lawyer before moving to England to work in the cotton trade in London. Prior to that, he met his wife, Ulrike Christine. You see the couple here, Wolfgang and Ulrike. They met on a seaside resort on the French coast in the late 1850s, early 60s, before getting married in Paris in 1868. The family records say, we love legend and myth. They always say in the family, they were married in l'Église de la Madeleine, so the famous church. In actual fact, I've been to the archives there, and there's no record whatsoever of their marriage. They were civilly married in Paris in 1868, but they weren't, which is probably not surprising given that neither one of them were Catholic. Both of them were supposedly baptized Protestant, Lutheran Protestants in Germany, but we'll get to his complex ethnic identity in a minute. The family undoubtedly acclimated to a South London life in Victorian England, and they became naturalized British in 1876. On the right here, this is their naturalization certificate. 4 brothers: Philip Valère Gustave, who was later a famous cinematic actor in Germany in the 1920s. His brother Fred Ernst Anton, who was also later a very well-known editor for tennis and sport periodicals and newspapers in London and Germany through the 1910s and 20s. And his last brother, Paul Robert. Anybody who wants to know more about their fascinating lives, I don't have time to go into it here. Not much is known about their early life, but he was probably a schoolboy in some of the South London schools, either at Christchurch or Lewisham. The area that they lived was a largely German immigrant population, where later on anti-Nazi activist Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom you've probably heard of, who wrote quite a lot as a German pastor against the Nazi movement. So the family lived there until about the early 1880s, when Wolfgang's commercial firm went bankrupt. And in 1884, they moved to Berlin, where the boys then enrolled in German schools. Manning finished his high school at the Friedrichswerd, I can't pronounce it correctly, Werdeschuss Gymnasium, where Turnvater Jan, if anyone knows a little bit about the history of gymnastics, was a teacher. And then he moved to Humboldt University and studied medicine, and then finished his studies in Freiburg, so kind of in the south of Germany. And that's where he played right wing for the Freiburg FC, and he started really his career as a sport administrator. He moved to the German Alsace in the early 1890s, was a doctor there, and at that time, I'm sorry, I was skipping that. He was fundamental in the founding of both FC Bayern Munich, with a good friend of his, Joseph Polak, who is, you can see on the picture here to the left, who then emigrated to the United States in 1903. And he was also a key member of the founding of the German FA in 1900. He was the first general secretary of the DFB, along with President Hoepe, which I have here was a professor, who was the first president. He only was in that role for 1 year before then moving on. He was also just missed being the German representative at the founding of FIFA in 1904. Here you have the announcements from Le French newspaper in 1904, which explained that Dr. Manning here was unable to attend the founding of FIFA, but was supposed to. Immigration to the United States. In 1905, he sailed on the SS Cuxhaven, SS Hamburg, sorry, from New York to New York, and he arrived some interesting circumstances where he came to meet his wife, Luella Kimmel, who was born in Erie, Pennsylvania. She clearly was waiting for him because on his immigration papers here, on the passenger manifest at Ellis Island, they record that he was coming to visit a friend who, within 6 months, would be his wife. At the romantic date of February 14, they got married in 1906. So our doctor may have been slightly romantic as well. The Mannings started living in the upper west side of Manhattan, living there until about 1930 when they moved down off Madison Avenue, very close to Carnegie Hall, Times Square, and Broadway. During his time in the U.S., he was a leading figure in the structuring and the merging of two national associations, becoming the USFA, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about from David later. And he was explicitly thanked for his efforts with the creation of FIFA in the New York State Minute Books, which solicited his support that was essential due to his friends on the continent, without which the AAFA's affiliation to FIFA never would have been obtained. In actual fact, when the USFA representatives were there in 1913, 1914, it was in fact the Germans, Hefner, a German, the head of the DFB there, who supported, they were the ones who supported the affiliation of the US Federation against some initial tension from the English FA, who, for whatever reason, I'm still exploring that, were against the affiliation of the US. And Hefner was, as we can see from his previous background in German football, he was a member of the DFB back when. So it was in those German circles that Manning met Walter Benzmann and Ivo Schricker, who was the first chairman for Strasbourg FC, and then much later the general secretary for FIFA for a number of years. After the creation of the USFA in 1913, he served as a liaison with Europe and a firm promoter of the connections with FIFA as the chairman of the USFA's Foreign Relations Commission for the better of 30 years. He was even called the Moses of soccer in the USA. He served on many of the USFA's committees, Olympic Committee, the Rules Committee, the National Amateur Challenge Cup committees, but also at the local level in New York as the president of the Field Club Soccer League. During his first years as the USFA president, he also spoke of the importance of teaching the younger generation the game and furnishing instructors and referees to schools. So was clearly associated with the promotion of youth soccer at the time. He was also a regular member of the American Olympic Committee's executive committee throughout the 1920s and 30s, and the head of its commission on soccer on a number of occasions. At the Olympic Committee executive, Manning regularly met with big figures in American sports politics and sporting and politics, including Franklin D. Roosevelt and the future five-star general Douglas MacArthur, who were all members of the American Executive Committee. It appears that Manning was very politically savvy, but at times very stubborn and sometimes outmaneuvered. The U.S. football team, soccer team in 1934, largely owes its spot at the World Cup to our doctor's masterful lobbying to FIFA during that time, where he wrote to the Belgian Executive Committee member Seeldreers, to William Campbell, who was the counselor for North and Central America at FIFA, and to his longtime friend, Ivo Schricker. Through astute positioning and petitioning in the summer and fall of 1933, he was able to convince FIFA to change its qualifying procedure in order to give the U.S. almost certain entry to the 1934 World Cup. However, sometimes his principles left him isolated, and he was one of the two members of the American Olympic Committee to resign in protest in 1938 of the planned Tokyo 1940 Olympic Games on the basis that Japan was still at war with China, and it was against the Olympic spirit to hold the Games in a country at war. That put him at odds with the American Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, who outmaneuvered Manning by commissioning a survey of athletes on their desire to participate in the Games, which created a ground support for U.S. participation. Obviously, the Games never happened, but Manning was one of the only two who was slightly sidelined during that process, along with William Bigham from Harvard. Manning was a strong promoter in 1945 at the restructuring of FIFA and reaching out to include both the British and the Russians to be reintegrated and members of FIFA. And the doctor played a clear role in the creation of the North American Football Confederation, the preceding CONCACAF body, in 1947. A few words about his military. He was a military man as well. He served in the First World War in the Medical Corps in 1917, rising to the rank of major in April 1918. He even obtained leave when he was on service in Camp Custer in order to attend the Western Pennsylvania's general meeting in 1918. So the man was completely committed to his soccer duties. His multinational upbringing certainly helped his communication. Ivo Schricker at FIFA wrote regularly to Manning in German in the 1930s, all the way until 1944, when he switched his correspondence to English, largely because of censorship and the fact that his German letters just weren't getting through the post. Signing off one letter, Gassman, to FIFA General Secretary Gassman, he wrote "Au revoir" à Paris in 1953, which was actually the last letter that Manning wrote, or at least that we have a copy of. And it was actually in Paris where Manning was at a dinner with a number of other FIFA executives where he caught cold, was sick, flew home, and within 2 weeks died in New York. He had already been suffering from coronary heart disease, but he had been better and well enough to go. Whoops, there we go. I'll try and wrap up with some closing questions. There's a number of open questions I have about Manning. There appears to be a very strong Jewish network of Anglo-German connections based around people like the Manning brothers, Walter Benjamin, Josef Pollack, who was the founder of Bayern Munich, and Franz John as well. However, his Jewishness is not necessarily very clear. He was listed as Jewish when he registered as a university student in 1892, but his tombstone has a Christian cross on it. He also obviously he abstained in the vote for the 1936 Olympics in the participation of the U.S., though it's not clear whether it was with respect to amateurism and professionalism or if it was actually with respect to the German politics about the Nazi regime. And as a FIFA Executive Committee member between 1948 and 53, he was the first American to serve on the Executive Committee. He was also the point of contact with the reintegration of Germany, and he was in contact with the military government in Germany on this question. He also was crucial and essential in getting the Japanese to be re-invited to come back to FIFA. And I guess if I were to summarize Manning's life, it was one of a founder, a builder, perhaps a visionary, with savvy diplomatic skills, but who often moved on from projects that he started. He was a unifier with the belief that sport, as he said once in a quote, sports are undoubtedly a binding tie between nations, and of the various sports, soccer rates higher, perhaps than any other international game. And this is 1930. The same universalist spirit is what drove him, and he may have been stubborn, resigned from multiple roles at the USFA, the AOC, and even the New York State as president. But he was often called upon when those organizations were in conflict, and he was a mediator and a source of unity. It's unclear also what role his life had with respect to his wife. She's conspicuously absent from everything that I've ever discovered about him. But discretion is a quality, and perhaps her qualities lay elsewhere. She clearly loved her husband enough to pass on a scrapbook with all of his memoirs through their family, which is in some part how I've come across a lot of this material. But his life was also missed opportunities. He missed the foundation of FIFA in 1914. He was unable to take a team to the 1916 Olympics in Berlin, which didn't take place, which would have been a homecoming for him. He was unable as well to be part of the 1928 and 32 Olympic Games in LA, where he would have been able to welcome the world, his world of football and soccer, because soccer was not on the Olympic program. He lived to see his adopted country beat his native one in 1950 in Brazil, but he missed the 1954 West German miracle, which he had in some way helped to prepare by his encouragement of reintegrating Germany inside of FIFA. In short, he was a German, an Englishman, a Jew, an American, a doctor, and a soccer administrator. He was an immigrant and a transnational citizen. He was a husband, and though he never had any children of his own, he was a father to football. So, thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
I believe you said, if I understood you correctly, you said in 1913 England opposed the United States' involvement in FIFA?
In the FIFA Congress minutes, the FA is actually vehemently opposed to the U.S. affiliation at that point.
I thought England wasn't part of FIFA until after World War II.
No, they were, and then they were out, and then they were in. They're there. Typically.
It has to do with that cup.
In a large part, does
Yes.
it? And I hope you will. I hope you will talk maybe a little bit with the New York State.
Not today.
Okay.
But certainly.
This evening.
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing was is that the AFA was affiliated with the FA, and so
The AFA
it's AFA.
What does that stand for?
in the
American Football Association.
Yeah,
They were
that's the AFA Cup. And yeah, Roger.
Well, I think they were not so much opposing the United States as they were opposing the particular group
Exactly.
of Americans.
Because there were two competing bodies, and one, and this is where Manning is the key figure because of his continental connections. He was the one stimulating, saying, look, in New York we need to be members of FIFA, whereas the AFA, they weren't necessarily along those lines, and they were happy just to be connected with the British.
Essentially, the New York State Football Association got really mad about banning players from the Pilgrims Tour, especially that's kind of like the thing that really did it in. New York was isolated from New Jersey and New England, and the New York State Football Association essentially dissolved to become the American Amateur Football Association. They appealed to FIFA. When the AFA found out about that, they went to the FA and said, hey, wait. So then they tried to get in. And I think Manning, it's interesting that you're talking about bad timing. He also had remarkable timing.
Absolutely.
I think people like Agar and Cahill and Manley, some of these figures in New York that were trying to guide the game in a certain direction, said, oh, he knows these guys over there. He can get us across the line, and he did.
Well, the little quote here is, you can't read the handwritten minutes, but if you read the New York State minute books, they're very explicit about how, Manning was nobody. From 1906, when he arrived in New York, he was a doctor. He's registered as a doctor in the city directories, but you don't find him in the press. The first reference to him is as a referee for German club games, I think in 1908, 1909. And then all of a sudden, he just kind of shows up. He just parachutes into these committees, and they invite him to the executive committee for the New York State when we're talking about the affiliation, and he is clearly a bridge, which few other people at that time are able to do. Yeah.
So that
that document itself, that's in Illinois, correct?
Exactly.
Right? Right. So what was his relationship with Cahill? Because in those entries, they're always twin. In those
Yeah.
early meetings, they're always twin. And then there are further documents about antagonism between he and Cahill, and others have written about that as well.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that the Vanderways, you know, people know P.E. Vandaway, when I think of the Vandaways, the basketball family, they were really a soccer family then. I think he was showing up at the Germania games,
Mhm.
and they were like, you guys are having this struggle, this guy actually knows those people over there.
He was. I mean, they say, look, he has all the friends in the German FA. He was born in England. The guy spoke perfect German. He spoke French. He was. Come back to your question with respect to Cahill. I haven't kind of crossed both biographies. That would be an interesting piece of
So
work
you've
to
got
do.
Moses, and then you've got the father.
Exactly.
Right, as David Wenger puts it.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Well, given that, no.
So there's hesitance, but we can talk about
Sure.
this later.
Sure.
But I take your point that these are the people who seem to be most